of our center's board, Colorado law has one of the top natural resources programs in the entire country. The mission of the Getches-Wilkinson Center is driven by an ambitious agenda for deeper influence in law, applied policy, and practice, and to be the premier training ground for a pipeline of diverse future leaders. And we do that through creative interdisciplinary research, experiential teaching, and innovative problem solving. Just one example of our on-the-ground experiences that we offer for our students is the Acequia Project, providing free legal services protecting the water rights of low-income Hispanic farmers in the San Luis Valley. And as the Dean noted, one of our favorite things to do is convene thought leaders and practitioners, just as we are today, to address the most pressing issues of our times. The GWC runs largely off of donations and grants, so I want to take a moment to thank our series sponsors whose generous support allows us to ensure events like these are free and accessible to all. So big thanks to the Bureau of Reclamation at the Department of Interior and the Walton Family Foundation. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's speakers, which our discussion today will feature Nancy Smith, Director of External Affairs for the Colorado River Basin at the Nature Conservancy, Lauren Reese, Deputy Director, Colorado Water Conservation Board, and the GWC's Doug Kenny, who will be serving as the moderator. You can learn more about each of them online. Also, I want to make sure you know that we are recording this entire series, and each webinar will be available within a few days. So feel free to tell your colleagues and share this information on Twitter and Facebook if you're so inclined. And today we are certainly inviting your comments and questions. So it's a little different than you might see normally. It's the Q&A feature at the bottom, not the chat feature. So be sure to enter your questions into the Q&A feature. And with that, Doug, it's all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me see, am I on here? Okay, I'll trust that I'm on. I can't see my screen. Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Dean and Naya, for the nice words of welcome, and certainly for the nice words directed at me personally. Thank you so much. Alice has introduced our speakers, so I won't do that again, but I will just add that it's a bit of a homecoming, a virtual homecoming for our speakers. Nancy is a graduate of the CU Law School, and Lauren and I worked side by side here at the center. I don't remember at the time if it was the Getches-Wilkinson Center or the Natural Resources Law Center, but probably 15 years ago, a long time ago. So it's nice to virtually welcome you both back into the fold. So thank you for joining us. We're going to start with Nancy, I've seen her slides. I must confess, I know what she's going to talk about, and I'm very eager to hear because she's followed directions perfectly, knows covering exactly what I think we need to talk about. After that, we will hear from Lauren, and then at that point, I'll have collected some of these questions that you guys have been will have sent in, and then we'll do some Q&A. But with no further delay, Nancy, why don't you take over?
Fantastic, thank you. And yes, I'm a proud CU alum, and I might add that I had the pleasure of learning from both Professor Wilkinson and David Getches. So very happy to be with you all today. So I have I am the overview person. So of course, the unenviable position of having too much information to cover. So please note that many of these slides have a lot more detail than I will actually cover. A lot of the detail is there to just give you a sense of the scope of options out there for financing water work. And it will be available after the talk if you'd like to dig into any more of the detail in your spare time. Okay, so Lauren will cover the Colorado Water Plan. This presentation looks at things primarily through a Colorado lens, knowing full well that everything I will discuss has analogs that apply to anywhere in the Colorado River Basin or across the West, but really using Colorado as an analog. And I've tried to structure the presentation so we go from the most traditional financing options to the most innovative. Here's a list of what we'll cover as I go through. Okay, so let's dive right in. The Colorado Water Plan, which Lauren will go into great detail into, so I'm going to be very, very brief. It roughly identified $20 billion needed to execute all of the activities outlined in the plan. For the most part, we estimate, those of us in the conservation community, that around 18 billion of that will be covered through more traditional project proponent typical funding sources. So there's about a $2 to $3 billion gap that we have to fund. And the key point too is that a lot of the environmental and recreational goals in the plan probably fall in that gap. So there's a lot of incentive to try and fill that gap. And this, as I said before, this doesn't just happen in Colorado. In other states too, you have this gap. You've got project proponent funding sources to cover more of the traditional infrastructure type top projects, but there's this gap. So we're going to talk about some different ways to fill that gap throughout the Colorado River Basin and beyond. I do want to note all of these funding options and mechanisms overlap and touch on each other. So bear with me, we've broken them apart in this particular way, but I know they all touch on each other. So let's start with the most traditional, state and federal funds using public money to pay for a public good, water. The first note up there is the granting programs. Lauren's going to go into great detail about Colorado granting programs, and they serve as analogs for other states, so I'm not going to go there. I did want to particularly touch on bonds, however. Colorado does not have bonding authority. We can't do bonds. And bonds have been incredibly successful across the country for generating funding for water-related projects. Clean water, reliable water, resonates very much with voters. And I just made a list here. You can see it's been successful all the way from North Carolina to Long Island Sound, generating water funding through public bonding. And I put at the bottom the 2014 California water bond down here. This is, probably the Mac Daddy of all water bond efforts that we're all well aware of. 2014, they pulled off a $7.5 billion bond. And you can see from the list of how they allocated that money, it really touches on the full range of water activities that have to happen in the West. Providing clean drinking water, doing more of the environmental protections, drought and climate preparedness, water recycling, groundwater sustainability. These are all the types of topics that we have to deal with in the West to have healthy watersheds. Okay, let's move into federal sources. I'm just going to briefly touch on, we're all familiar with these very traditional sources, but just want to highlight the places to go for people who are trying to fund water work. The NRCS has millions of dollars available for water-focused activities. Primarily, of course, this is working with producers, be they ranchers or farmers, incentive contracts, etc. So traditional source, but a meaningful source for when you're working with producers. WaterSmart, Bureau of Reclamation, is another agency with specific funding sources dedicated to the types of water issues we deal with in the West. This is a slide directly from their website. It highlights the 6 different programs they run. I'm not going to go into them. I just want you to know WaterSmart programs have federal funding for the types of activities we need to engage in. But I did want to highlight that one of the tricks of this funding source is that eligible applicants are those that are listed. And you will notice that it is only entities with water delivery authority. So I imagine a number of our audience members might work in the not the NGO sector. These funding sources are not available to NGOs. It requires you to partner with water delivery authorities. So there are some tricks around this in terms of who's eligible. Also, there is some debate about how well this money is being spent. I think this funding source has yet to deliver on actually funding projects that generate co-benefits for society, the environment, etc. So there's improvements to be made with this funding source. Now, this is one of those slides that I was telling you about. Lots of detail I'm not going into, but you'll have access to it later. Just wanted you to know there's also a lot of federal funding sources related strictly to water infrastructure. With the Getches-Wilkinson Center, we're looking a lot at environmental benefits, but obviously there's a lot of human service benefits to having clean drinking water. Here are some of the federal funding sources available for smaller communities or disadvantaged communities. to deal with water infrastructure needs for safe drinking water. You can come back to this later and refer to this. Okay, let's move slightly more innovative. Let's look at some ballot initiatives. Ballot initiatives, you can see over here on the side of the screen, they've been very successfully used for decades to generate money that can be used for water benefits. You know, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is real money that really matters. I put the quote down at the bottom to just point out that the organization I've been with for 20 years, the Nature Conservancy, our research shows and our polling research shows again and again and again that even in difficult political climates, such as we have today with polarized discussions, money for water and conservation in general comes through. It still speaks to voters. As late as 2018, Americans passed 7 of 9 conservation ballot measures and had a passage rate of 78%. I really wanted to highlight that money for water, for clean water, for healthy rivers, that kind of language, it resonates with voters, it works. Now, this is another one of those slides. This is not detail I'm going to go through. This is for you to look at later. I wanted you to have a sense of the huge variety of funding sources that ballot initiatives tap into to generate money for water. That list at the top, bottle fees, sin taxes, the marijuana taxes, new water tap fees, those have all been looked at in Colorado and other states and have been tested through polling and found to have legs. In Colorado, recent studies estimated that these sources could generate over $500 million annually to fund water work. At the bottom of the slide, I have put actual water funding ballot measures that have been successful. These are not bond measures. These are other funding sources such as parcel taxes. You'll see, again, a marijuana tax. And I've put the dollar figures on the side to show you that these things are generating real money. It's resonating with voters, and there's lots of different types of taxes and sources. You can come back and refer to this. Okay, let's keep moving towards the innovative, even more innovative funding options. Local ballot measures. I wanted to highlight, oh, and I'll note on the previous slide, I know Lauren's talking about the sports betting measure, so I'm not going to go into that. I'll leave that for Lauren. Local measures, you know, the fact is that in a state like Colorado, and honestly states across the West, it's hard to pass statewide measures that raise taxes. It's the classic Western anti-tax positioning. But local measures tend to be more successful. Voters tend to feel that there is a local benefits are accruing locally in these local measures, so they tend to pass at a higher rate. The first 3 items listed on this slide are going to be on the ballot for 2020, and those are either the Colorado River Water Conservation District-wide, or you can see there's 2 water district mill levy increases. City and County of Denver is doing a climate protection fund, which has some river restoration dedicated money in it. Down below, in previous years, Pitkin County has had a very successful local tax measure that has generated funding for their Healthy Rivers program. Grande County did something recently in 2017. Grande County is still figuring it out. They don't have the track record that Pitkin County has. But in the Roaring Fork Valley, Pitkin County, they've used that water to do water transactions, improve diversions, promote conservation. And then I threw in the Atlanta, Georgia at the bottom just to point out this isn't just in Colorado. There are other states that are also passing very local measures to fund water. It works with voters. Okay, let's continue on. Now I'm going to move into the most innovative, private and blended funding sources. We don't tend to talk about these as much in the water community because they're new, they're emerging. Of course, we're all very familiar with the classic private philanthropic foundation sources. Walton Family Foundation, who was mentioned earlier as a supporter, they of course fund water work very robustly. Rockefeller does, the Moore Foundation. So I think we're more familiar with the big institutional philanthropic donors who support water work. But I wanted to talk a bit about less traditional modes, such as impact investing, water funds, and ratepayer fee schemes to fund water. Typically, I'll just note, it is typically hard to access private capital for water projects because the prior appropriation system of the West has largely kept private investment out of water, anti-speculation laws, et cetera. So there are issues with the legal framework. In some ways very good, in some ways it has hindered the ability for private capital to be invested in water projects. So that's important to know right up front and keep in mind. I want to highlight this liquid assets report. It was done, gosh, I think it was about 3-4 years ago by Encourage Capital. It was supported by the Walton Family Foundation. I highly recommend this as a resource for those who want to dig in deeper. It's available in its full form online. They really looked into how can we get more private capital into water projects that will produce social, environmental benefits, as well as addressing and improving water security. This table on the side of the screen, it looks at the private capital investment mechanisms that they identified as the best options. You have environmental impact bonds, you'll see at the top for both forest health and riparian health. You've got incentive contracts for ranching and crop conversion infrastructure upgrades. I'll talk about the next generation water trust idea at the end, and also talk a bit more about these pay for performance contracts. Highly recommend this report. It's available online for those who want to dig in deeper. This is a figure from that report that I could do a whole talk just on these options. So again, in the overview position, I just want to highlight for you more detail about what environmental impact bonds are is available in this report. Let me say in general, the overall thesis of this entire growing movement of looking at private capital is that there are substantial opportunities for bringing private capital into the water world, even within existing regulatory frameworks. And they can be, if they're designed right, they can realign stakeholder interest towards sustainable management. So this whole body of private capital, they're looking at how to create mechanisms that actually incentivize management behaviors that will produce environmental and social co-benefits. That's the main thesis of all of these. And they, maybe I'll leave it at that. I also know later in September, Doug, I believe the center has one of these webinars focusing on private capital investment possibilities. So there'll be more to come on that. Water funds, I'm going to quickly touch on. They are another interesting model popping up around the world. I work for the Nature Conservancy, so we have created 34 water funds all around the world, but there are over 60 water funds, so lots of NGOs and public sector parties playing in this field. What is a water fund? It's really a collective decision-making body that unites public-private sector entities and then comes up with a unique sustainable funding source. Funding sources for these vary greatly. These are some quick examples. There's a Truckee River Fund. I tried to find Western water examples. This water fund pulls together regional water authority user fees. This is that model of tapping on utility payer fees. It's collectively managed by a citizen board. It's generated about $7.5 million over the past 13 years. The Salt Verde Alliance Water Fund down in Arizona is great. And it shows up in the corner, those funding sources. It shows you how water funds blend funding sources. It brings together municipal taxes, private foundation money, corporate money. A lot of corporate folks are playing in this arena now to generate social license to operate. And then it pulls in federal money. It's what some of these blended water funds can do. They can bring together diverse funding sources to do the kinds of activities listed there. Improve water management, improve infrastructure, produce environmental, social co-benefits, as well as water security. I'll highlight one more, the Rio Grande Water Fund. This one's focused on forest management. A lot of water funds are focused on forest health, source water protection. And this also brings together blended sources. It's got funding from the cities of Albuquerque and Santa Fe that depend on the Rio Grande for their water supply. It also then brings in Forest Service money. It also then brings in corporate money who are looking for a great story to tell their customers. Okay, last, I guess just the last two, moving to the most innovative, pay for performance contracts, or sometimes you'll hear them called environmental impact bonds, pay for success. These are really a new model that are emerging. You've got the state of New Mexico is using these pay for performance contracts to improve sage grouse habitat. They haven't been used as much in the water world. However, state of Washington is using them to produce stormwater benefits. The idea is that money, it's not like a traditional grant where you grant money based upon a plan of action. Rather, people are paid contractually for producing the kinds of results that are established out of the beginning. They can blend, much like water funds, they blend private capital sources with state and federal money. And there's this whole great website called the Pay for Performance Toolkit where you can learn loads about these. Finally, this is the most innovative and early stage. There are lots of folks out there looking at avoided cost models for generating funding. It's based on the idea of risk management. As we all know, risk is growing, is doing nothing but growing in the Colorado River Basin. Climate change, population growth is really creating a system that is could be on the tipping point of not being able to manage the risk of prolonged drought and climate change. These models look at calculating the negative impacts of doing nothing and then encouraging the water users to invest in a variety of activities to limit their risk. Activities that might include water conservation, flexible mechanisms for managing shortages, such as demand management, which we've heard about, investments in watershed resilience to promote retaining water, forest health management to protect source water. You might have heard of these as called next generation water trusts. That's another name they use for them, the idea of using a water trust to manage risk. Okay, and that is my rapid fire overview.
That was rapid fire, and it was exactly what I was looking for. So thank you so much. We have a couple of questions, but I'm going to move those to after Lauren's talk because I think she might get at a few of those questions. So without further delay, Lauren, why don't you take over?
Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen here. You guys see my intro slide?
Yes.
Perfect. The wonders of technology. Thank you for having me, and congratulations, Doug, on being on the verge of retirement. That's
well,
amazing. Closer than I am, that's for sure.
Well.
But yeah, thanks for having me. Always glad to participate in CU events. So I'm Lauren Riss. I'm the Deputy Director for the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And I'm really going to spend my time after Nancy's overview talking about the current lay of the land as far as existing funding sources and challenges and really some of the limitations that we see with those tools that we currently have at our disposal. First, though, I wanted to provide just a little bit of context about the Conservation Board, if you're not familiar. We are an agency in the Department of Natural Resources. We were created about 75 years ago to provide policy direction on water issues. We have a range of expertise and programs that provide technical assistance to carry out our mission, which is to conserve, develop, protect, and manage Colorado's water for present and future generations. We're governed by a 15-member board that's appointed by the governor, and we have a staff of about 50 people. And this is important. We're not regulatory. We don't enforce water quality standards. We don't administer water rights. We are responsible for the state's water plan. And we lead policy discussions on a range of topics, including water supply planning. We're knee-deep in Colorado River issues with Nancy, watershed health, water efficiency, conservation, et cetera, et cetera. So, as I said, because we're not regulatory, We really rely on the carrot approach rather than the stick. And the best carrot is the green kind. And so we do have a lot of different funding programs at our disposal. It's really how we provide the incentive to accomplish a lot of the work, which allows us to carry out our mission. Principally, we have a water project loan program, which is really our moneymaker in the agency. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but our loan program provides low interest loans, primarily for the design and construction of agricultural and smaller municipal and hydro water projects in Colorado. We also have anywhere between, depending on the year, between 10 and 16 different grant programs that cover a variety of different needs, including most recently our water plan grant program, which really goes to advance the goals and objectives in the water plan. We have the Water Supply Reserve Fund, which supports our basin roundtables, which are the stakeholder groups located throughout Colorado in the river basins to fund local water projects. We have watershed restoration grant programs, ATM, alternative transfer method programs for the ag sector, drought recovery, and then technical assistance programs that help folks leverage federal funds. And I included the website there. There's a whole bunch more on our website, including criterion guidelines and applications for how to apply to those funding streams. I wanted to provide kind of a high-level overview, and similar to Nancy, the next few slides here are going to have a lot of detail, and I'm going to not get into it today for purposes of this discussion. I think what's most important is just kind of the high-level understanding about where our funding comes from, because that really plays into the challenges that we're seeing immediately here with COVID. So at a very high level, where we get our funding is primarily from these three buckets you see here on the slide. And of those three, we have two primary sources of revenue. One is severance tax, and the second is really the interest that we get generated through our water project loan program. So the first bucket there, our construction fund, is our big cash fund, and that is where we operate our revolving loan program. It combines treasury interest, federal mineral lease revenue, and interest that's acquired from our loan program. And then this in turn goes back to fund additional water project loans. It funds a lot of our operations, and it supports a bunch of those grant programs that you saw on my earlier slide there, and allows us to make bigger investments in water projects. The second bucket there is our perpetual base fund. This fund includes water project loan interest and treasury interest. And the big kicker here is that it also statutorily gets 25% of the state's severance tax revenue. And this fund can only be used for loans. And then finally, the DNR Severance Tax Operational Fund is probably the most complicated. It also gets 25% of severance tax revenue. I'm going to get into this a little bit more in my next slides. But what I want to emphasize here is that for the state's purposes, we don't get any general fund. So the general fund is the state's primary operating budget fund. It receives 95% of its revenue from income and sales taxes, and with a few small exceptions, we don't get that. So we are really dependent on our loan program interest and severance tax primarily. So here's a breakdown of how severance tax goes in the state. You can see right off the top, half of that goes to the Department of Local Affairs to offset impacts to local communities that see a lot of oil and gas development and mineral development, and they have a grant program that they then funnel that money back into the communities. Then you can see the orange pie slice there, that's our perpetual base fund. We get 25%, that goes to water project loans. And then the gray slice there is that complicated severance tax operational fund. And what's important to know about that is DNR is the state department that has about seven different agencies within it. And that slice there goes to fund the core operations, including FTE, in a bunch of those agencies within DNR, including the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, Parks and Wildlife. We get a very, very small slice of that, along with the Avalanche Information Center, that then we turn around and use for a grant program. but it's my point here is that severance tax is a really hard-working revenue stream. To break down that gray pie slice before, so this is a snapshot of how the funding flows from this gray pie slice. It goes to fund the core programs there on the left, the agencies in DNR, and then by statute, once that funding obligation is satisfied, there's a $17 million reserve, and then what's left over from that goes to fund a few different grant programs within CWCB and a couple other grant programs that exist elsewhere in state government. So again, I'm not going to go into the details here of the fund balances, though they're listed on the slide. The important thing here is that we do get a cut of this severance tax revenue from DNR, but only after it goes to satisfy these core programs and a reserve. So severance tax is volatile to begin with, and we basically just get kind of this spillover when it's available. Given the COVID situation that we've seen, I'm going to talk more about severance tax projections here, but on average, we typically see about $5 million going to both our perpetual base fund and DNR's operational account. We typically see about $40 million in those. This year, we're expected to see $5 million. So we are actually not going to have any severance tax revenue available for this year and most likely next year to support the grant programs out of this severance tax revenue stream. So this is, we live and breathe by the revenue forecasts for severance tax. It's how we do all of our budgetary planning, and they come out quarterly. This is a snapshot from a table in the June 2020 forecast. We're actually getting another one that comes out this Friday. So I expect that these numbers will change a little bit, but I think the trajectory here that we can see from June is what we can expect to see going forward for some time. And that is, you can see the red circle there. They projected an 81% decline in statewide severance tax revenue compared to last year. And that's really resulting from a historic collapse in oil prices that occurred mid-March from COVID. Global oil prices declined about 24% in March. And it was the second largest one-day decline on record. And of course, following all of the shutdowns across the world, and when the US started implementing stay-at-home orders, we saw a significant dampening in the demand for oil. Transportation consumption accounts for about 70% of oil demand in the US. And so with fewer people driving and using air travel, we really saw demand go down. And as a result, we have less severance tax to operate our loan programs and our a number of our different grant programs. And so just a little bit more of the fallout here. In addition to the severance tax decline, of course, we also saw at the state level, the general fund facing a big shortfall. Coming up after the shutdown starting in March, our fiscal year at the state runs starting July through June. And so we had about 3 months where we had an unexpected decline in general fund revenue. And so the General Assembly and the governor had to issue a variety of emergency executive orders that basically took back some funding that had already been appropriated. So even though the CWCB doesn't get a very big slice of general fund, we had some that was appropriated specifically for some Colorado River programs this last year. We have seen a pretty significant belt tightening. So for the last fiscal year, we had some funding that was appropriated from the general fund that went to Colorado River demand management feasibility efforts. And some of that funding was redirected to backfill the general fund shortfall. And because of the general economic uncertainty, we then delayed a lot of our grant making decisions until we had a little bit more information about what was going to happen on this new economic climate. And so for this current fiscal year that just started in July, the legislature was facing for this fiscal year a $3.3 billion deficit for the general fund. And they are statutorily required to pass a balanced budget every year. So that $3.3 billion had to come from somewhere. And being an agency that has a fairly sizable cash fund, kind of is a bullseye in years like this. So the legislature took $45.5 million from our perpetual base fund, from our severance tax revenue, and then redirected it to support the general fund deficit that we were seeing. So as a result, we're not seeing distributions to our severance tax supported grant programs. And in addition to that, the state has a Tabor emergency reserve requirement, which is basically in an emergency spending situation like we currently are in, the governor, through his budget office, has the ability to earmark funds throughout state government as emergency backfills, basically. And so our construction fund, our other primary source of funding, has $33 million that is tagged with this Tabor emergency reserve, which means we basically have to take it off the table. It has to remain solvent and viable to use really at any moment's notice to support emergency spending. However, it's important to note that our other big money maker, which is our loan program, has been operational, and we are working as hard as we can to make sure that that stays viable. But for the next fiscal year, starting next July, really a lot of TBDs there. But I think given the trajectory of where we're headed with both the general fund and severance tax, we're looking at really not being able to have a whole lot of spending going forward in the short term. So with all that doom and gloom, I did want to include some good news. There is a bright spot in all of this, and that is, as Nancy mentioned, sports betting is now legal. Proposition DD was approved by Colorado voters this past November, and is one of those statewide ballot initiatives that Nancy was talking about. And it went live as of May 1st, just as everything was shutting down from coronavirus. So the way this works is that it creates a 10% tax on the revenue collected from sports betting, and the majority of that funding then goes to support our water plan grant program and some efforts related to the Colorado River Demand Management feasibility effort. And so, we were not expecting a whole lot since there weren't very many major sports to bet on, but at least to my surprise, even with most major league sports shut down until very recently, Coloradans still wagered more than $25.5 million on various sporting events during that first month. That's back in May, when really all there was to bet on was like table tennis and MMA fights, I think. And then since then, according to the state's Department of Revenue, more than $59 million was wagered in July, which to me is incredible. I guess I don't have a good pulse on the sports betting scene, but that was encouraging to me. And so of the total that has been raised, the state has received about $500,000 in taxes since this has been legal, since May. So there is an obligation to backfill some of the startup costs on the order of about $1.7 million before we will start to see some of that funding for water projects. So we still have a ways to go, but given the dire circumstances that this first got started under, I feel pretty encouraged about the potential for this. Initially, we were projecting that this might raise about $15 million annually for the grant program. I think we'll have a much better idea of the potential for this new revenue stream maybe after this football season, if all goes well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how this funding conversation fits into our water supply planning efforts and the water plan itself. So in the state, we are on about a 7-year water planning cycle. And we really started that conversation back in 2010 when we released one of the state's statewide water supply initiatives. And this was really a supply-demand gap analysis that projected municipal and industrial water supply gaps out to the year 2050. And as part of that, the analysis estimated that by the year 2050, we would see about 17 to 19 billion and funding need for water projects, and roughly 2 to 3 billion for environment and rec projects. And these are the numbers that Nancy referenced at the beginning of her presentation. And so we incorporated that into the state's water plan in 2015, where we said, you know, of that roughly 20 billion funding need, we estimated that about 17 of that would be funded through existing ratepayers and existing sources, leaving about a $3 billion gap need, plus needs for environment and rec projects. And as part of the water plan, we have a variety of measurable objectives that we have according to the different sections of the water plan: conservation, storage, supply, watershed health, and so forth. And we had a measurable objective for funding in the water plan. So water plan came out in 2015. Then in 2017, we issued a kind of an update, a report, kind of how we've made progress. And back then, you know, we were really in the thick of conversations about funding. The goal and objective in the water plan was that the state would investigate options to raise an additional $100 million annually to fill that funding gap. And I think, you know, the more we talked about that and had conversations with our stakeholders, it really came to light that the data set that was based on, I guess to borrow a phrase from George Bush, was kind of fuzzy math. And, you know, we didn't have a concrete list of projects and costing needs that really added up to that funding need. And I think it was kind of a back of the napkin estimate, you know, based on good experience, but it really wasn't supported by a list of projects, for example. So moving forward, last summer, we came out with the latest water supply planning analysis, which we're now calling the Analysis and Technical Update to the Colorado Water Plan. And this really provides a consistent statewide framework for examining future water supply and demand under different planning scenarios. It also includes updated modeling and demographic projections in order to estimate the ag and municipal water supply demands under 5 different scenarios that also incorporate, for the first time ever, climate change. So we have new supply demand gaps that are based on ranges depending on future scenarios. And a part of that analysis and technical update, we also included some new tools, including an environmental and recreational flow tool, and also a project costing tool that we are asking basin roundtables to use to update their basin implementation plans. So the way the planning process works at the state is it's kind of an ABC cycle, where first we come out with the analysis, and then B, it goes to the basins to incorporate that new data and modeling into their basin implementation plans, and then C is the comprehensive water plan update, which we're aiming to have complete by the end of 2022. So leading up to that comprehensive water plan update, we're really just beginning to consider any revisions to the goals and objectives that we identified in 2015, and are starting the stakeholder and outreach process for that statewide update. And we're really in the thick of working with the basins to use the new technical information to update their local basin-specific water supply implementation plans. And so how does this fit into the funding conversation that we have been talking about? So I think I want to take just a brief step back. I saw that there were a couple of questions related to bonding and why we can't do that in Colorado. Back in 2003, there was on the ballot a water projects bond referendum known as Referendum A. It was defeated. The measure would have allowed the Colorado Water Conservation Board to borrow up to $2 billion for public and private water projects by issuing bonds. So you'll remember the $2 billion sounds like a lot, really pales into comparison to California, California's bonding authority. But the answer to those questions, why can't we, is that the voters have to approve it, and we have not been successful in getting that approval on the ballot. And so this Ref A lesson has really loomed large over funding conversations around the state, especially when you're talking about these statewide ballot initiatives to generate funding for statewide projects rather than more localized efforts. And you know, the referendum A was really widely considered to have failed because there weren't a specific list of projects that proponents could point to for how the funding would be used. Voters don't like to fund blank check initiatives, and this, it was easy to target because there weren't a list of projects. And so the state, we have to walk a pretty fine line here, because unlike CDOT, we don't have a list of state-sponsored water projects that we can point to as projects that we're endorsing as needing funding. We really, in Colorado, have a decentralized grassroots water project process where basins decide what their priorities are and really come together as geographic communities to decide what their priorities are and what their water needs are. And we at the state try and support those processes and planning efforts and provide funding where we can. But it's a little bit different because we don't have a list of projects that we've endorsed on the front end. And so as a way to work through this, the governor has a series of wildly important goals called WIGs for short throughout state government. And this year has announced a water WIG. And that is that it calls for us at the CWCB to work with the Basin Roundtables to create a prioritized database that identifies accurate costs for 500 projects across the state. So using that project costing tool that I talked about as part of the technical analysis and update for the water plan, we're really using that to identify a tier 1 and a tier 2 list of priority projects. The tier 1 is not meant to be a priority of most important projects, but really projects that are ready to go, ready to launch, that could be with available funding that could be ready to implement. And then tier 2 then would be priority projects that are in need of further evaluation, but are well into the pipeline and planning process. And so with limiting funding available, you know, we're really seeing this as a way to allow the state and other funding sources to stretch available funding resources to fund projects that will provide the most benefit. It's not an effort, as I said, to rank projects or to prioritize one basin over another. It's really about creating a group of projects that represents Colorado's collective needs that would be ready to implement. We realize that not all projects, we're trying to shy away from the term shovel ready, because obviously not all projects have a shovel, and that projects that have stream flow enhancements or education or planning efforts are just as critical as the traditional infrastructure projects. But we're really trying to develop a solid list of projects that have costs identified and are ready to go. So with that, I guess I just wanted to close it out with some thoughts about the future. Obviously, a lot of what I've talked about has been in our new COVID reality and the economic consequences that we're seeing as a result of that. But before COVID, pre-COVID times, there were several ongoing conversations about how to generate a sustainable long-term funding source for water projects. The Interbasin Compact Committee, which is kind of an advisory group made up of members from the stakeholder roundtable groups, and new groups developed, one called For the Love of Colorado, had really begun having conversations in earnest about what a sustainable source of funding could look like. And groups like TNC, through Nancy's efforts and Environmental Defense Fund and a couple others, had done quite a bit of polling around what funding mechanisms really resonated with voters and what their potential for generating revenue was, as Nancy discussed in her slides. You know, now I think that we are in a new economic reality, and not only given the pandemic, but also facing some emergency spending issues on wildfire and drought and having to backfill the general fund. You know, I'm really expecting these conversations to take a backseat until we're out from this economic shadow from COVID. But you know, once we get back on our feet and we're able to have these conversations again, I think the ongoing challenge for these statewide sources of funding is really in competing on the ballot with the other funding needs that may have a higher profile, notably transportation and K through 12 education. But you know, I think that's still in our future, and I'm hopeful that with the new database of projects that we're working on developing and really solidifying some of these conversations in the update of the water plan, that we'll at least have our house in order and be able to make a solid case for future funding going forward. So that's really all I had, and happy to take any questions, Doug, however you want to.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Thank you. Boy, fantastic presentation. Covered a lot of ground, and you transitioned us into the Q&A, where I really wanted to ask you about water bonding and referendum A and that whole experience. So you kind of answered that question for me. You also mentioned that Colorado doesn't use any of its general funds on these water programs. I was curious as to, is that typical of Western states, that they don't use their general funds to fund some of their water programs? And I guess the part B of that question, and I don't know if this Lauren or Nancy wants to take this, part B of that question is, it's been my understanding that in the next legislative cycle, and maybe it's the next one after COVID cycle, that I should expect to see a lot of new water funding proposals being considered. And I guess my question is, what is in the pipeline politically in terms of, I mean, and you started us into this conversation, but is there anything specific coming? And is this idea of using general funds, is that totally off the table entirely? So Lauren, you want to take first? That's
a lot of questions, Doug.
Well, you got 30 seconds, so go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. I'll start with the general fund. I mean, I think at least for the short term, we don't have a chance at using any general fund, for our purposes. And in fact, I think it's pretty likely that we're going to actually be asked to help support the general fund. So I think that's a pretty hard no. As far as what's coming down the pipeline, I have to expect that this legislative session for Colorado will look a lot like the weird truncated session that we saw a couple months ago, which was very laser focused on meeting the most immediate needs in the state of Colorado, balancing the budget, making sure that we have the emergency funding resources to support our Medicare obligations, K through 12, some of the, just really the foundational state budget obligations. I could be wrong, but we are certainly not proposing any new innovative funding efforts for water projects. That doesn't mean the legislators won't try, but that's not something that we are jumping on.
And Doug, I just want to add, so folks know, this is not a general rule in other Western states. New Mexico uses general fund for water projects. And in fact, actually, Utah stands quite a bit apart, that unlike the other Western states, it is actually flush right now, despite COVID impacts. So Utah's state funding is fine right now. So I just want to note, Lauren's giving a great Colorado perspective, but it is not the perspective across the Colorado River Basin.
Interesting. Okay. Let me try to squeeze in one more question, and then we're going to wrap this up, because I'm trying to stick to our schedule here. And that last question is, I mean, Lauren ran us through a lot of numbers, and I tried to keep up, and the numbers are hard to keep up, especially since the COVID year is different than every other year. But on an annual basis, how big is this gap we're talking about in Colorado between you're talking about that $3 billion of mostly environmental programs in the state water plan that don't have a funding source. Yet then Lauren talked about at least 12 different grant programs that, yes, this year they're in chaos, but in a normal year, I just can't get a feel for what's the scale of this gap. Do we need another 50 million a year? Do we need another 200 million a year? Percentage-wise, number-wise, just help me understand how far we are from where we need to be.
Lauren, can I jump in quickly on that one? You know, a community of nonprofit organizations, ag interests, ranching interests, recreational interests got together and analyzed this. And the sense was that over the life of the water plan, if you just want to do really back of the envelope math, that about $100 million per year for the life of the water plan would cover that gap. Now, that isn't necessarily the state's perspective, and I'd defer to you, Lauren, but I'd say that's the user interest group perspective.
Okay.
I would say, Doug, that since we came out with the water plan in 2015, that we've learned a lot. And I think what we've learned is that there are a lot of information gaps out there about what the need is. And I think those numbers, you know, I called it fuzzy math that we had in the water plan, was back of the envelope. We know that there's a need out there, but in large part, I think some of that is, you know, kind of what we see coming from the NGO community for a lot of those projects. We have a fairly passive grant program, and I think we're looking at ways that we can be more hand in hand and working on developing projects that really are targeted towards meeting goals and objectives in the water plan and working with grant applicants on the front end. But, you know, we had a lot of questions about, you know, does that gap include match? So, you know, is the state's portion meant to be that, you know, that total amount, the 2 to 3 billion, or does that also, is it double that because of the match that would come in from the local communities and other funding sources? So I think I'm hopeful that this effort that we're going through right now statewide to develop a list of projects will really shed a lot of light on that, and we'll be able to have some concrete projects that we can use to estimate the funding need rather than these sort of generalizations.
Okay, fantastic. And for anyone who hasn't done sports betting yet and bet on table tennis, it's Russian table tennis, by the way, so it's fascinating. They're not very good.
It's a voice of experience.
You can watch on your phone. You can watch them play table tennis and bet on it in real time. So yes, it's, you know, boredom is a problem during the COVID era. So you might want to give it a try. But I think we are out of time. I will thank Lauren and Nancy, and fantastic presentation. We will provide the materials to anyone who wants it. Just let us know. This will all be posted online. If it isn't, I think it's live streaming already, but it'll be there. So thank you all. Sean or Alice or anyone on my team, if you wanted to say something, say it now. Otherwise, I will just thank you two and all our attendees and say, hope to see you all at our next event, which is on the 24th.